Welcome back, honors. Welcome back to your flip classroom and our continuing discussion about Mesopotamia. Well, continuing barely, because we actually took a really long time to actually do and talk about. Oh yeah, like to do and talk about and go over a bunch of your. No, you're good. To go over a bunch of different stuff on your warm up today. Now, a little quick comment on that. First of all, had a blast with y'all today in class. It was actually so much fun. Love the guessing game we did with the map. I'm learning more and more about y'all. I'm learning your names. It was a really good time. And I love the fact that I don't remember what her name is, but she has cats on her computer. Really knows maps really well. So also that y'all don't know the difference between Libya and Lebanon, but we'll work on it. It's not a big deal. So the big thing about it, though, in general, is we talked a lot of stuff in the warm-up today. Now, we don't usually spend that much time on the warm-up, but the thing about it is talking about that early human history time period and talking about, the methods of plant and animal domestication, talking about the invention of farming, talking about the shift between the Paleolithic to the Neolithic time period, and all that stuff is really, really important, right? It's really important. It takes time, and I like hitting you with a bunch of animal facts and telling you the difference between monkeys and apes because we're talking about the evolution of human beings over time, going all the way from Australopithecus to Homo sapiens. So, take that. So the big thing about that, going on into it as well, is we're now talking about our very first civilization, right? We're talking about our very, very first civilization in the sense that we are actually now going to be covering Mesopotamia. Started off today in class talking about a couple things about Mesopotamia, like where that word comes from today, right? We actually said that it means in Greek, the land between two rivers, right? We talked about those two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates River, and then Allie in the back also helped me out really, really well. Thank you, Allie Mixon, I appreciate it. You helped me out in the back really, really well talking about how that is located in modern-day Iraq, all right? So, if you want to go ahead and jot that down, you are more than welcome to. The big thing about, though, going into it is it is going to last for about 3,000 years. It is, for about 3,000 years, it's one of the first major settlements to arise, okay? And it's going to really establish itself in about 4,100 BC. It's going to show up just one chapter in our book, not textbook. I don't have textbooks. I am the textbook, as you've already figured that out. Does that mean more like in our proverbial, our metaphorical book, metaphorical book, the chapter in our book right before the Egyptians? Now, the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians actually existed right around the exact same time as each other, but they're intrinsically two very, very different places. And we would like to actually talk about them kind of side by side so we can compare the two of them next to each other, whereas Mesopotamia was a series of different city-states, and then actually, Egypt was a centralized kingdom that had one unifying culture that actually spanned the entire Nile River for an upper and a lower area. Going into it, though, you also have to understand is we got to start off with the Mesopotamians, though, because they were there first. And we'll end up kind of fast-forwarding and then rewinding and then fast-forwarding and then rewinding and then talking about how they kind of existed at the same time. The big things about Mesopotamia, though, to kind of just go ahead and check off your list and understand that you know very well and make sure that you got it. What you have to understand is we were talking about a civilization that was the first to do things like irrigate fields, create writing, develop mathematics, which one of you actually said in class today. What was your name? You're really, really nice. You sit right over there next to the Isabella squared, Isabella, and then you said math, and you were very, very right. And the thing about it, though, is they created writing systems, they created math, they also invented the wheel. Interestingly enough, the Sumerians did. And then also they learned to work with metal, both bronze and iron, all right? So, bronze and iron we'll get into a little bit more. We'll talk a lot more about bronze, actually, when we get to the ancient Greeks, because we'll discuss, what the stuff's made out of, how an alloy works, how it's different as a forgeable metal from a lot of other things. But let's go ahead and dive into this head first, right? So the big thing that we need to understand about the Fertile Crescent is where that word comes from. So, Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, same thing, same place. So you have to understand that we are talking about the Fertile Crescent is the nickname of Mesopotamia. And both of those things, this Fertile Crescent / Mesopotamia, is in this region of the world, right around the base of the Zagros Mountains, next to Iran, and what you would now consider modern-day Iraq. So going into it, though, also just like Allie said, right? So now, we have the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and the reason why it's referred to as a fertile crescent is because, like we said in class, the fertile ground that's created by the floods and also the irrigative systems that are actually used on these two rivers created a crescent moon shape, right? As you can see right there, right? I know some of you are like, that looks more like a blob. Yeah, okay, calm down. It can't be perfect on a map. It's going to be fine. But look at that little crescent moon shape right there. And most of the places that we're going to be talking about in all these ancient civilizations are actually going to pop up in and around this area. So we'll be kind of in the Fertile Crescent, out the Fertile Crescent, in the Fertile Crescent, out the Fertile Crescent, bat, 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 bat. And we'll actually kind of delineate when we get there, when we jump out, when we jump back in, and all these other things, right? And speaking of the Egyptians, as you can see, they're right next door, right? Right next door, popping up right around the exact same time. Now, the thing about it, though, is for most of you that have ever actually looked up anything, had a geography course with Mr. Wooderson, because he's such a stud, knows all this stuff, so much more bougie than I am. It's super annoying. The big thing that you might have actually understand is that you know that the Middle East and Iraq and stuff like that, in your mind, you might actually have a vision of what that place looks like. And the thing is that that area of the world is much more a desert, dry-like climate than somewhere that you would think a major civilization would develop, albeit the very first one. So going into it, you see if it's like fertile. Are we sure about that? Because the Fertile Crescent geographic conditions in the area, it's like very little rainfall. It's very hot. It's very dry. All right. So it also gets windstorms that leave like really muddy river valleys in the winter that are almost impossible to traverse and almost borderline impossible to actually farm on. And then on top of everything else is that over hundreds and hundreds of years, the biggest thing that defined the entire area was catastrophic flooding that occurred every spring when the ice caps on the Zagros Mountains would melt, causing a huge influx of water to fly down those rivers and then leave a massive amount of catastrophic flooding. And I don't mean like flooding, like chill, but it is very, very important to understand that in the Fertile Crescent, the flooding was really, really intense. It could destroy things. Whereas ironically enough, in ancient Egypt, it was actually much more well-timed. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we actually get into the Egyptian stuff. But also, the soil contains very, very little minerals, which is not very good for planting. And there's also very little stone resources. And as you can see by looking at this expansive field right here, there's almost little to no timber as well. Now, timber is, of course, just referring to trees that you can use for building materials, used for actually like creating different systems and tools and things like that. So it really feels like looking at this thing right here, you're like, why would anybody want to settle there? Like if you're a traveling band of nomads and you finally figured out how to farm going from the Paleolithic into the Neolithic era, you're domesticating your dogs and your cats and all the other animals and things like that. Goats were the big ones that were actually domesticated almost immediately after those two. But going into it, you're like, why would I want to settle there? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that over hundreds of years, something was created by that catastrophic flooding. And it's something that I love teaching to kids from Louisiana because y'all know what this is, all right? Like, you have no idea. I used to teach in New Jersey and North Carolina where they just don't get the thing that I'm about to talk about. But over hundreds and hundreds of years, the catastrophic flooding caused a big movement of soil and dirt into these big, big, big embankments that actually people realize that, wait a minute, if I stay on that and put my village on top of it and the river is lower than this embankment, it will actually protect me from floods and make cutting canals into it much easier. And I'm talking about no other than natural levees. All right, so a levee. So why would anyone live in Mesopotamia? A lot of it has to do with the availability of levees, okay? So natural levees, though, not man-made ones. You'll see man-made ones. You know what a levee is, right? You live in Louisiana. You know what levees are that keep the Mississippi River back. You know what levees are that keep canals from flooding over and destroying stuff. The thing about it, though, is these natural levees were created after hundreds of years of flooding, and it caused these big embankments. And you would build the location of your town or city right up here on the top. And the fertile soil made by silt and sediment left behind over hundreds and hundreds of years of it sweeping the only nutrient-rich dirt down the river and into one area was right about here on this little angled area at the bottom. And then desert and swamp was left on the other side. So the thing about it, though, is what's really, really simple and easy. Some of y'all are probably like, I still don't get it, though, Mr. Terry. Why is a natural levee so important? Well, the thing about it is that these embankments produce massive buildups of sediment over hundreds and hundreds of years of flooding. And when the people that wanted to settle the Fertile Crescent area realized that all I need to do is just do some little simple thing, and stay on this thing, is because it's going to provide natural protection from huge floods. So what's going to end up happening is the floods will just simply crest over the levee and then swamp down into the other area where your house won't be underwater. Your feet just might get a little wet. But the bigger thing about it is, more than anything else, is it makes irrigation much easier. Okay, now irrigation is massively important. When you're talking about it in Mesopotamia, some of you are probably like, oh my God, I'm having flashbacks to 6th grade when I talked about this in Mrs. What's-Her-Face's class or Mr. What's-His-Face's class when he talked all about, irrigation, Mesopotamia. It's still important. It is an important thing to understand. What irrigation is it's a system of moving water, okay? So when you're talking about irrigating something, it means that we're just going to cut into this natural levee to the water line to allow the water to then run down this little area and bring it straight to our fields where we will then plant on the fertile soil, the most fertile soil that we can find. Irrigation system is basically digging canals and then using these things known as dikes or dams to control the movement of water, okay? Now, a dike, what that is the difference between a dam, okay? A dam, like when you think about being built by beavers and stuff like that, and also this conversation sounds like really, really rude and inappropriate, but it's not supposed to be, all right? The big thing about it, though, is a dike and a dam are two very, very, very different things. The dike on one end is a door that can be opened and shut. So when the irrigation system, when you think about the big canals in New Orleans, those are dikes on the actual front of those canals that can be opened and shut to regulate regulate the amount of water. Dams, on the other hand, are built concrete solid. Like when a beaver builds a dam, it's not meant to be moved, and it's not meant to regulate water. It's just meant to keep it back permanently. So the thing about it, though, is the difference of using these two items, dikes, dams, and canals, you can now move water around to make farming much easier, okay? And that's only because these natural levees exist. Without them, you can't cut into them to allow gravity to pull the water down, so you're just kind of stuck there taking buckets full of water one at a time. Nobody wants to do that. So the natural levees provide that ability, and the irrigation systems can easily be actually constructed. You just cut into it, and then you just create doors to guide the water around. Now we're living high on the hog, and we're growing stuff like foodstuffs like peas and cereals, oats, barley, all this different stuff that makes the base thing that every single ancient civilization eats all the time. That, of course, being bread. You have to understand that looking at human history is so directly tied to the actual making and consumption of bread, okay? Because literally it becomes the staple thing that most people eat all the way up until basically, when you think about it, now. Like, I mean, when you really think about it, how many of you had a sandwich today? How many of you will eat some bread-based product even tonight? Like, when I go home tonight, I might not have bread, but I guarantee you within the next day that I will. So human history is really tied closely connected to our ability to grow grains, right? And that irrigation system in Mesopotamia, it's going to make it all possible. Now, the other thing you got to understand about Mesopotamia more than anything else is it's not necessarily a place. Now, they share a lot of commonalities between each other, but the thing about it is Mesopotamia is a region, okay? When I showed you that map and stuff like that, that fertile crescent area, all that green swath of fertile land that was sitting right there, the big thing that you need to understand more than anything else is that we use the word Mesopotamia to refer to the whole area that several different city-states were started inside of. So the thing about it is it's a huge region home to tons of city-states. But the thing about it is, though, also, there occasionally were some really big, strong ones that got really, really big and very, very active that actually took over big chunks of the Fertile Crescent, or basically had the controlling stake of the entire thing. Those in order being these following ones, right? Sumer, Akkad, or the Akkadians that lived there, Akkad, Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, Hittites, Assyrians, and the Neo-Babylonians. Now, the big thing that we'll do is we'll actually move through these kind of one at a time because different groups of them invented different things that we use all the time. We will focus heavily on Sumeria, Babylonians, Assyrians. Those are going to be the three big ones that come out of like the Mesopotamian region that actually contributed a lot of things that we still use today. Now, no other one than being the Sumerians. The Sumerians made the most stuff that we use today, but the Babylonians are going to make a system of law that's super important, and the Assyrians are going to be super militaristic, and they're going to kind of change the waves of history in a lot of ways when they take over and like conquer all these different areas. Now, going into it though also, you have to understand that speaking of those areas, speaking of those cities, they all came up with some common things together. That's why we lump them into calling them Mesopotamia, right? Mesopotamia, the region, had some commonalities between every single city-state, even though all the city-states did little tiny things unique from one another. So going into it, we got to talk about all the different things that these Mesopotamian city-states came up with independently of one another, or not independently, together, and then later on we'll talk about how they're just a little bit different from each other and how it actually has a lot to do with these things known as warlords taking over large armies and then exacting control over other areas. Because unfortunately, ever since human beings learned to farm, and even before farming, war has been a massive theme of history in general, right? The taking, using, and hoarding of resources is a very important thing to understand, because when you take, use, and hoard resources, somebody else wants it. Now, going into it, though, the things that we're going to be talking about in this little section, we're going to be talking about writing, literature, religion, and architecture. Now, there'll be a little bit of a subset. You don't need to write these down yet. Listen to me carefully. Do not write these down yet. You hear me, Delilah? Delilah, do not write all those things down yet, because we're going to go through them one at a time. Let's start off with probably the most important one that the Mesopotamians or any Mesopotamian city-state actually used, and they all use together. It's systems of writing, okay? Now, the thing about it that you have to understand really quickly, more than anything else, is before we even start talking about their writing, we need to talk about human writing overall. Now, writing systems in general go through several distinct phases, okay? Like throughout history, there's several different types of writing, and there's also different versions of writing, okay? For example, you can see a massive difference between how Easterners write by comparison to how Westerners write. Westerners use alphabetic numeric systems, whereas a lot of Eastern cultures use something as a syllabary, and we'll get into that right now. So the thing that you need to understand is that earliest forms of writing were all started off as pictograms and ideograms, right? And what that means is it's a sign that represents an entire word or an entire abstract idea, okay? Now, for example, Mesopotamians and Egyptians. Oh, gosh, sorry, I had to get that out. That was that lunch, like, fighting me back. Now, look, big thing about it, though, as well, is both Mesopotamians and Egyptians Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, all those guys. They all started off using pictographic, ideographic styles of writing. That means that they would have a sign or a symbol that represents an entire word. Now, over time, that's going to change a little bit, and they're going to start moving to these two systems. There are also phonetic systems, also known as alphanumeric systems, which means it's an alphabet system based on sound, right? So, for example, phonetic style like writing is what we use, right? When I'm trying to spell my name is Caleb Terry, right? I'm going to immediately go like, all right, Caleb, C-A-L-E-B, Caleb, right? And every single letter goes together with a distinct sound to actually create the word itself. And then we assign a definition to that word, and bang, we got writing, all right? So like now, the other thing about it too is there's another type of writing that actually is going to pop up as these cultures begin to split, and like these like ones move eastward, they're going to create syllabaries. Many Eastern cultures use syllabaries to this day, which is a symbol that represents an entire is a symbol that represents an entire syllable. For example, right, if you were to take my name, Caleb Terry, and actually apply that to an Eastern style language, and if I had one of my former students from China, or one of my former students from Korea, or one of my former students from, I've taught kids from all over the place. I had a student from Vietnam as well. Like if I were to actually talk to them and I said, can you write my name in your language, please? They would actually use 4 characters to write the whole thing. 2 for Caleb, 2 for Terry, because it's Caleb and then Terry. And that's a syllabic language, right? But those, again, are more Eastern-style languages. Western-style languages usually gravitated towards pictograms and then eventually moved to alphanumeric, phonetic-based systems, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, something else you got to understand is why is this so important to talk about? Why do you need to know the styles of writing, the types of writing, and what type of writing popped up originally in Mesopotamia? Because theirs was the first type of writing, okay? Why do you think they invented writing in the first place? Was it more to convey ideas, or was it more to keep track of things? That's exactly right. Name I'm going to try to remember. Yes, Shelby. Ha! That's exactly right, Shelby. Writing became very, very important because they had to keep track of crops, right? I heard you over there, Shelby. Shelby was like, you got to keep track of crops and stuff like that so you don't die. And I'm like, exactly. Good job. High five. Now, look, big thing about it, though, going into it is it allows you to account for all that stuff, right? And it allows you to transmit ideas. But the original use behind writing was like, okay, we have X number, all right, so of bushels of like wheat, okay, and it will survive and give us sustenance as a community through the winter. Oh no, we don't have enough. We need to grow more. That's going to be the biggest reason why actually like writing systems, numeric systems, and all that stuff begins to pop up. Now the other thing about it too is it's all about the transmission of ideas. Okay, you also need to codify things. For example, when you start actually using complex language to like talk about a lot of stuff, you then have to codify your sets of laws. Now going into it though as well, you have to understand what was that very first writing that the Mesopotamians, particularly the Sumerians, actually came up with. Well, it's this thing known as cuneiform, right? And this is what it looks like. Cuneiform itself actually means wedge shape, right? Wedge shape. Because literally all of the markings that were actually used in cuneiformic writing were these little like triangles that you could actually write into different things. Now the sad part about it is that we cannot translate cuneiformic writing completely because we've lost the ability to do it. Over time and over the expanse of years and things like that, as cuneiform began to fade away and they moved towards Sanskrit writing and stuff like that, we actually lost a lot of the records that gave us the ability to actually do it. But the other question about it is, too, is looking at this, you got to kind of ask yourself, how the heck did they do that? How the heck did they even, like, how do you do that? How did you actually make it so you could even write on that tablet and stuff like that? Well, what they would do is they would actually reach into the bottom of the rivers and stuff like that and get a big old lump of clay, and then they would take that lump of clay and just go, bam, and they would, oh, that just hit me in the face. So they would just go, bam, and they would actually slap it down onto a rock, and then they would write in it, and then they would leave it out in the sun to actually dry. And what they would actually do after it dried is they would then take in the tablet, and then bang, now we have our cuneiformic writing. Very genius perspective when you actually think about it. Very different from the Egyptians, too. They would actually carve a lot of their symbols later on. So going into it, though, also, it's so intensive a system that we even have, kid you not, we'll talk about this a little bit later, envelopes that are made out of stone too. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on, I think when we get to the Akkadians, because I think they invented the postal service. Now going into it though as well, this style of writing or this idea of cuneiform would actually spread to other places and then influence their writing systems. Persians and Egyptians later on would actually use cuneiform as a base system for their writing systems as well. And it inspired a lot of other different things. Now the Egyptians are going to actually use it later on, and they're going to be the very first ones that create alphanumeric systems when they take their hieroglyphics that started as pictograms and then they simplify them to mean letters and simple ideas, right? Now, here's the thing, though. But who learns how to do that? Who learns how to be like slapped with mud and actually do all that stuff and move forward? And who learns how to read and write? Because the thing that we need to understand about ancient societies is most people could not read and write. About like 1% of your population could read and write. It seems like it's like, then why are we even talking about it? Most people couldn't do it. Because most of it was actually done by higher order people so they could hold on to power, conserve power, and then also use the recording systems to officiate, dictate, and govern over people, right? Now, cuneiform led to the creation of an education system because you had to show people how to do this, and you had to teach them how to write. And the person that was actually taught how to write was what was going to be referred to as a scribe, right? Scribes actually had to go to school, but 9 times out of 10, when I say 9 times out of 10, always, scribes at the time were wealthy men. We're seeing what we talked about again earlier. When that differentiation from Paleolithic to Neolithic societies occurred, we're seeing people actually give certain jobs to men over women, right? So scribes always had to be men, and they always had to be wealthy. The other thing about it, too, is that scribe schools in Mesopotamia, this is a fun fact, scribe schools in Mesopotamia were super, super strict. This right here is a bunch of older men teaching these young boys how to write. And as you can tell, they have the clay in their hand, and they're pressing the cuneiform stylus into it, trying to make sure they write. But the thing about it was cuneiform was a pretty complex language. It was really, really hard to teach somebody, so they made mistakes from time to time. Well, if you make a mistake in clay, you can't really do anything with it without actually making it wet and starting all over again. So they were very strict about teaching these boys how to do this. So we have some sources that lie around that apparently the scribe teachers would actually cane and beat the boys if they ever messed it up. So if you screw up, put, like I'm spelling on my name and I'm like, C-A-L-I-B, smack! And like literally they would actually cane each other, like trying to make sure they did it right. Now over time though, scribe schools are going to eventually start teaching other things as well because they become basically the most educated people in all of their cities. Scribe schools eventually are going to start teaching math, botany, literature, and other multifaceted subjects as well. Speaking of literature, let's go ahead and talk about that real quick, and we're going to end it all right here. The thing about it that we need to understand is that with writing, if you can write something, not only you're going to write a little bit, but you're going to start making up stories too, right? So like now, you can record historical events, you can record laws, you can record crop rotations, you can record all that different stuff. But one day, somebody who knows how to write is going to be like, well, what if I just made something up and wrote it down, right? And so you're going to lead to the creation of literature, right? So the very first fictional stories and the creation of literature also popped up in Mesopotamia, again, starting originally in Sumer, right? Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh is probably the most famous story and encompasses the idea of the hero's journey. And Gilgamesh is the first known work of great literature and considered to be the very, very first form of an epic long poem that outlines the tale of a hero. The big thing about it, though, is that since this is S period, I'm going to run out of time here soon, so we're just going to cut it off there, and we're going to talk about a bunch of really cool stuff, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Epic of Gilgamesh in class, and we're going to talk about him and how he was basically the Mesopotamian Hercules, and how he actually started out as a really bad guy. He was a terrible king, but he did meet a friend that actually took him on the straight and narrow and helped him be a better person, and his name was Enkidu, a wild, naked man. But we'll talk more about that in class. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.